For thousands of years, empires rose and fell behind walls that were built to defy armies. These are the ancient fortifications that stood the test of time. Here's 15 ancient walls that withstood invasions. Let's start with number 15, the walls of Constantinople in Istanbul, Turkey. Few defensive structures in history have a reputation as legendary as the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. Built in the early 5th century under the Emperor Theodosius II, these fortifications protected the Byzantine capital for nearly 1,000 years. They stood against countless sieges, earning a reputation as one of the most effective defensive walls ever constructed. The system consisted of multiple lines of walls, ditches, and towers that stretched over about 6 kilometers across the landward side of the city. The innermost wall was about 5 meters thick and over 12 meters high, and it was reinforced by towers that were spaced about 70 meters apart. In front of this stood another wall and a deep moat, creating a layered defense that attackers found nearly impossible to overcome. On the seaward sides, additional walls protected the city along the shores of the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara. From the 5th century until the 15th century, these walls withstood sieges by some of the most powerful armies of their time. The Huns under Attila threatened the city, the Avars and Persians attacked in the 7th century, and Arab forces besieged Constantinople twice in the same period. Later, Bulgars, Rus, and even Crusaders tested their defenses, and the walls turned back nearly all of them. The use of Greek fire, a Byzantine incendiary weapon, also played a role in the city's survival, especially against naval attacks. Ships that approached the seawalls risked being set ablaze by this mysterious substance, which reportedly burned even on water. The wall's reputation became almost mythical. For centuries, Constantinople was seen as an impregnable city, largely because of these defenses. It wasn't until 1204 during the Fourth Crusade that attackers managed to breach the walls, and even then, it required a combination of betrayal, luck, and a naval assault. The city was eventually retaken and the walls repaired. The final breach, though, came in 1453, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II besieged the city with a massive army and the latest in siege technology. Those were large cannons capable of battering the stone walls. Even then, the Theodosian walls held for nearly 2 months before being overcome. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, but the walls themselves remain standing. Many sections still survive in modern Istanbul today. The walls of Constantinople, they're remembered not just for the longevity of them, but for what they symbolized: the ability of a well-built fortification to shield the city from centuries of attack. For a millennium, they were the standard against which all defensive walls were measured. Number 14, the walls of Carcassonne, France. In southern France, the medieval fortress of Carcassonne is surrounded by some of the best preserved defensive walls in Europe. While construction began as early as the Roman period, the fortifications were expanded and reinforced in the Middle Ages, creating a double line of walls with more than 50 towers. These defenses allowed Carcassonne to withstand repeated sieges, and remained a key stronghold in the shifting conflicts of medieval France and Spain. The original Roman walls, built around the 3rd century CE, enclosed the hilltop settlement, but as threats grew in the medieval period, the fortifications were expanded. By the 12th century, the city had a complex system of outer and inner walls, with towers that provided overlapping fields of fire and gates designed to trap and expose attackers. During the Crusade in the early 13th century, Carcassonne became a focal point. The Crusaders, sent by the French crown and the Catholic Church to eliminate the Cathar heresy, besieged the city in 1209. Though the defenders eventually surrendered due to lack of water, the walls themselves remained intact, an example of their strength. Afterwards, the French monarchy reinforced Carcassonne further, making it one of the most formidable fortresses in the region. They were tested again during the 100 Years' War and later conflicts between France and Spain. Each time, the double wall system with its towers and battlements gave the defenders a decisive advantage. The outer wall slowed the attackers, while the inner wall provided a fallback line. That layered defense made a direct assault costly and often futile. By the 17th century, advances in artillery reduced the effectiveness of medieval walls, and Carcassonne lost much of its military significance. Yet, unlike many fortresses, its walls were never demolished. In the 19th century, an architect undertook a major restoration, ensuring that Carcassonne's defenses survived into the modern era. Today, the walls stretch for nearly 3 kilometers and include 52 towers, making it one of the most complete examples of medieval fortification in Europe. This city became a symbol of authority and endurance, standing firm through centuries of conflict. Number 13. The Walls of Xian, China. China's long history of city building is filled with examples of huge fortifications, but few have stood the test of time as impressively as the Walls of Xian, historically known as Chang'an. Originally built during the Tang Dynasty, when the city was the imperial capital, the walls we see today were rebuilt and expanded during the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century. They do remain among the best preserved ancient walls in the world, still encircling the historic center of Xian. These walls stretch over 13 kilometers in length and form nearly a perfect rectangle with gates on each side. The base is about 15 meters wide and at the top is about 12 meters. That's broad enough to allow chariots and soldiers to patrol along the ramparts. At intervals of about 120 meters, defensive towers project outward, giving archers the ability to cover the wall's flanks. Corner towers, watchtowers, and large gatehouses added further layers of defense, and these walls were built with tamped earth, faced with brick and reinforced with stone. They were designed to withstand not only direct assaults, but also prolonged sieges. Attackers would have faced moats, barbicans, those are outer defenses around the gates, and overlapping fields of fire from the towers. Throughout its history, Xian was facing multiple threats from nomadic groups on China's northern frontier, as well as internal rebellions. The Ming walls, combined with the city's location and the eastern end of the Silk Road, ensured that Xian remains a secure and prosperous urban center for centuries. While gunpowder eventually changed the nature of siege warfare, the massive scale of these walls still offered some protection well into the early modern period. Unlike many ancient city walls that were dismantled in the 19th and 20th centuries, Xian's walls survived, largely intact. Today, they're a defining feature of the city, visited by millions each year. The survival of these walls speaks not only to their strength, but also to the enduring importance of fortified cities in Chinese history. Number 12. Hadrian's Wall, Britain. Stretching across northern England from the River Tyne near the North Sea to the Solway Firth on the Irish Sea, Hadrian's Wall remains one of the most famous defensive structures of the Roman Empire. Built beginning in 122 CE under Emperor Hadrian, it marked the empire's northernmost frontier in Britain. The wall wasn't simply a barrier, it was a complex system of forts, mile castles, and turrets designed to control movement and defend against incursions. The walls originally stretched for about 73 miles or 115 kilometers and stood up to 15 feet high in stone sections, and slightly lower in turf-built sections. Behind it ran a military road, while ditches and earthworks provided some additional obstacles. Every mile along the wall, a small fort or mile castle housed garrisons of troops, and between these mile castles, towers allowed soldiers to keep watch and signal across huge distances. Larger forts like Housesteads, Vindolanda, and Bertiswald anchored the wall and housed cavalry and infantry units. Hadrian's Wall was not an impregnable barrier in the way like Constantinople's walls were, but it was never intended to be. Instead, it served as a controlled frontier line, slowing down raiders and regulating trade and movement. Forts and garrisons could respond quickly to incursions, and the presence of Roman soldiers projected power into the region. For nearly 300 years, the walls served its purpose, withstanding repeated attacks and ensuring that Roman Britain remained secure. When Emperor Antoninus Pius briefly advanced further north in the mid-2nd century, he constructed the Antonine Wall in Scotland, but it was soon abandoned. Hadrian's Wall remained a defensive line until the end of Roman rule in Britain in the early 5th century. Even after the Romans departed, the wall's stones continued to shape the land, often repurposed by later inhabitants for building churches and villages. Today, large portions of Hadrian's Wall still stand, and the root of the wall is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists will walk along the rugged northern English countryside following the line that once marked the edge of the Roman world. The endurance of this wall is pretty remarkable, though battered by time and weather. It survives enough to demonstrate both its scale and its effectiveness. But it also shows how a carefully designed defensive system could withstand invasions for centuries, controlling a volatile frontier in one of the most remote corners of the Roman world. Number 11. The Walls of Dubrovnik, Croatia. On the Adriatic coast, the medieval city of Dubrovnik, historically known as Ragusa, is encircled by one of the most complete and formidable systems of defensive walls in Europe. Constructed mainly between the 12th and 17th centuries, these walls were instrumental in allowing Dubrovnik to maintain its independence as a powerful maritime republic. The walls stretched nearly 2 kilometers around the old city, rising up to 25 meters in height in some places and reaching 6 meters in thickness. Towers, bastions, and forts reinforced the line at key points, including the impressive Bocara and Mincheta towers and the sea-facing fortress of St. John. The construction of it was adapted to the natural contours of the coastline, ensuring defensive advantage against both land and sea attack. The walls withstood repeated threats from the Venetians, the Ottomans, and even pirates who prowled the Adriatic. In the 15th century, when the Ottoman Empire expanded into the Balkans, Dubrovnik remained unconquered, largely due to these fortifications. As an example of their effectiveness, Dubrovnik was never taken by force. Instead, the city preserved its autonomy through diplomacy, tribute payments, and trade agreements, with the walls serving as a constant deterrent. The very sight of them made potential invaders think twice. In the modern era, the walls became symbols of Dubrovnik's resilience. During the Croatian War of Independence in the 1990s, the city again came under siege, and the historic walls absorbed artillery fire. Despite the damage, they protected much of the old town from destruction. Restorations have since ensured their survival. These walls remain proof that a well-built fortification could safeguard a small city-state for centuries against invasion, allowing Dubrovnik to flourish as a center of trade and culture in one of Europe's most contested regions. Number 10. The Great Wall of Gorgan, Iran. While the Great Wall of China is very well known, few outside of historians and archaeologists are even aware of the Great Wall of Gorgan in northern Iran. Sometimes called the Red Snake because of the red bricks used in its construction, this Sasanian-era wall stretches for about 195 kilometers, making it one of the longest defensive walls of the ancient world. Built between the 5th and 6th centuries CE, it served as a barrier against nomadic groups from Central Asia, particularly the White Huns and other steppe tribes. It ran from the shores of the Caspian Sea across the plains to the foothills in the Alborz Mountains. At intervals, it was reinforced by over 30 forts, each capable of housing hundreds of troops. Archaeological studies suggest that the wall may have required a garrison of over 30,000 soldiers to man its length, making it not just a wall, but part of a highly organized frontier defense system. The core of the wall consisted of tamped earth faced with fired bricks that gave it its red appearance. It measured up to 10 meters wide and 6 meters high in places, and behind the wall ran a canal system, both for supplying water to the troops and perhaps as an additional defensive obstacle. The Great Wall of Gorgan was repeatedly tested by invading nomads. Though parts of it were likely breached over time, it served its strategic purpose by slowing incursions and forcing enemies into a set of battlefields where Sasanian cavalry could respond. It remained in use for centuries as a key element of Persia's northern defenses. Over time, though, shifting political and military dynamics reduced its importance, and the rise of new powers and the eventual Arab conquest of Persia in the 7th century changed the region's defense priorities. Today, much of the wall lies in ruins, partly buried beneath farmland, but aerial photography and archaeological surveys have revealed its full extent. Scholars now recognize it as one of the most ambitious constructions of the ancient world, comparable in scale to China's Great Wall. Though less famous, the Great Wall of Gorgan is remarkable for having withstood invasions long enough to protect one of history's great empires. But even in ruin, it shows the strategic importance of walls in ancient warfare. Number 9. The Walls of Jericho on the West Bank. Jericho, often called the oldest city in the world, is home to one of the earliest known systems of defensive walls. Archaeological excavations at Tel es-Sultan, just north of modern-day Jericho in the West Bank, has revealed massive stone walls dating back to around 8000 BCE. These walls are not only remarkable for their age, but also for their function. They represent some of the earliest evidence of organized communal defense against both human threats and environmental challenges. These Neolithic walls of Jericho stood about 3.6 meters, 12 feet, high and up to 1.8 meters or 6 feet thick, built from undressed stone set in mud mortar. Now, inside the wall, archaeologists uncovered a stone tower nearly 8 meters tall with an internal staircase, believed to have been used for surveillance and defense. Together, these structures suggest that the people of Jericho already recognized the need for communal fortifications thousands of years before large urban civilizations emerged in Mesopotamia or Egypt. But why would such early walls be necessary? Well, scholars propose several reasons. First, Jericho sat at a valuable site near the Jordan River and close to important trade routes. Access to water and fertile land made it attractive, but also a potential target for raiders or rival groups. Second, the walls may have helped protect against flooding from seasonal torrents. Whatever the reason, the presence of a wall and tower suggests an organized society that was capable of mobilizing labor on a large scale. Later fortifications at Jericho were built and rebuilt over the millennia. The Bronze Age city that arose around 2000 BCE also had strong walls, which became legendary in the biblical account of the Israelites' conquest under Joshua. Archaeologists debate the accuracy of that narrative, but the fact remains Jericho's walls were real, substantial, and powerful. They became a touchstone for how ancient peoples imagined the strength of fortified cities. Jericho's location on the edge of a desert and river valley gave it opportunities and vulnerabilities. Its walls helped it withstand attacks during the turbulent eras when city-states across the Levant clashed. Excavations have uncovered multiple destruction layers showing that Jericho was attacked, destroyed, and rebuilt several times in antiquity. Each time, the walls were raised again, affirming their central role in the city's survival. That they still survive in part today underscores their significance as one of the earliest walls that truly withstood the test of invasion and time. Number 8. The Walls of Babylon, Iraq. Few ancient walls have really captured the imagination like those of Babylon, built and rebuilt over centuries along the banks of the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. Babylon's walls became legendary in antiquity for their scale and strength. Ancient writers like Herodotus described them in awe, and even if some accounts were exaggerated, archaeology confirms that Babylon's fortifications were among the greatest achievements of the ancient world. Babylon rose to prominence under Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE and later reached its zenith under Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE. By this time, the city was enclosed by multiple layers of massive defensive walls. Herodotus claimed they stretched for 56 miles, though modern evidence suggests they were closer to 17 kilometers in length. The outer walls were reportedly more than 20 meters thick in some sections and high enough to intimidate any approaching army. They were built from mud brick reinforced with bitumen. It's a naturally occurring tar that gave strength and water resistance. Now, Babylon's fortifications were more than just its walls. The Euphrates ran through the city, and engineers incorporated the river into the defenses by using gates with bronze-clad doors to control access by boat. Towers lined with walls at regular intervals provided positions for archers and slingers. Moats and earthworks added some further obstacles for enemies, and within the walls, gates like the famous Ishtar Gate, decorated with glazed blue bricks and reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons, projected power and piety. The most famous fall of Babylon came in 539 BCE, when Cyrus the Great of Persia captured the city. According to accounts, the Persians diverted the Euphrates River, lowering its water level, and allowed troops to enter through the riverbed at night. While the story is debated, it illustrates an important fact. Babylon's walls were so strong that only ingenuity, not brute force, could even bring them down. And then, Cyrus's conquest was relatively bloodless, suggesting the city's defenses were never actually breached in the conventional sense. The reputation of Babylon's walls entered legend. They became synonymous with strength, wealth, and endurance, symbols of a city that dominated Mesopotamia for centuries. While Herodotus may have exaggerated their dimensions, the truth is pretty impressive enough. Babylon was one of the most heavily fortified cities of the ancient world, and its walls stood as a bulwark against countless invasions. In the end, Babylon's fall was not due to weak walls, but to shifts in power, trade, and geography. As the Euphrates changed course and political centers moved elsewhere, the city declined. Yet for millennia, its walls represented the pinnacle of defensive architecture and shaped the image of Babylon in history and myth alike. Moving on to number 7, the Walls of Jerusalem, Israel, Palestine. Jerusalem has been fought over, destroyed, and rebuilt almost more than any other city in the world. At the center of this endurance are its walls, repeatedly constructed and reconstructed across millennia. From the first fortifications built by the Canaanites through the walls of King Hezekiah and King Herod, the massive Ottoman walls that still stand today, Jerusalem's fortifications were instrumental in helping the city withstand countless invasions. The earliest fortifications date back to the Bronze Age, when the city was a small Canaanite stronghold. By the 8th century BCE, King Hezekiah had extended the walls to protect the western hill of the city as Assyrian armies threatened. Excavations have uncovered sections of this so-called broad wall, built over 7 meters thick, designed to withstand siege engines and battering rams. Remarkably, the wall succeeded in helping Jerusalem survive Sennacherib's invasion in 701 BCE, when the Assyrian army ravaged much of Judah but didn't capture the city itself. Later expansions under Herod the Great in the 1st century transformed Jerusalem into a monumental city. Herod's walls encompassed huge new areas, including palaces, markets, and religious centers, and the fortifications were reinforced with towers such as the Tower of David, designed to project strength to both citizens and enemies. The Romans did eventually breach the walls, destroying the temple in 70 CE, but only after prolonged siege warfare that showed the defense's resilience. Even after the destruction, the walls were rebuilt. Byzantine and later Islamic rulers fortified the city again, ensuring its survival through the centuries of shifting empires. Over those centuries, Jerusalem's walls faced not just invading armies, but internal religious and political conflicts. Despite repeated breaches, the city remained a prize because its walls gave defenders time to resist and attackers pause to reconsider. They functioned not only as a physical barrier, but as a psychological symbol of Jerusalem's resilience. Today, the old city walls, Ottoman in origin but layered with history from millennia of rebuilding, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a reminder of how fortifications can shape a destiny of a city. Number 6. The Walls of Thebes, Greece. In the heart of ancient Greece, Thebes was often overshadowed by Athens and Sparta, but its fortifications were among the strongest in the Greek world. The Wall of Thebes, particularly during the classical and Hellenistic periods, helped the city survive invasions and play a decisive role in the shifting balance of power in Greece. According to legend, Thebes was founded by Cadmus, who was said to have built his first walls with the stones moved by magical creatures. While the myth aside, archaeology confirms that Thebes was fortified from the Bronze Age onward, with Cyclopean masonry, enormous stone blocks fitted together without mortar, similar to the walls of Mycenae and Tiryns. These early defenses enabled Thebes to develop as a major center. In the classical period, Thebes constructed even more formidable walls, reinforced with towers and gates. The most famous gate, the Electron Gate, became central in Greek mythology and history. By the 4th century BCE, Thebes was powerful enough to defeat Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, establishing a brief dominance over Greece. These walls played a key role during the invasions of the Persians in the 5th century BCE. While Thebes initially sided with the Persians during Xerxes' invasion, later Greek conflicts often saw the city switching alliances. The strength of these fortifications meant that neither Persians nor rival Greek states could easily subdue it without a prolonged struggle. Perhaps the most dramatic test came in 335 BCE, after the assassination of Philip II of Macedon. Thebes rebelled against Alexander the Great, believing the young king vulnerable. Alexander responded swiftly, besieging Thebes. For days, the city's walls held off his forces, demonstrating their strength. And ultimately, though Alexander breached the defenses, Thebes almost entirely was destroyed, leaving its walls in ruins. This destruction was a turning point in Greek history, and it showed that even the mightiest of walls could fall to an overwhelming force. But what makes these walls significant is their role in enabling a smaller state to challenge great powers. These were not as vast as the walls of Babylon or as legendary as those of Constantinople, but in the competitive, war-torn landscape of ancient Greece, they gave Thebes the strength to endure, resist, and for a brief moment, dominate. Number 5. The Walls of Nineveh, Iraq. In the heart of Mesopotamia, along the banks of the Tigris River, the Assyrian city of Nineveh rose to become one of the greatest capitals of the ancient Near East. At its peak in the 7th century BCE, Nineveh was not only one of the largest cities in the world, but also one of the most heavily fortified. Its massive walls stood as symbols of imperial power and as practical defenses against the constant threat of invasion in a region marked by shifting empires. The construction of the fortifications of Nineveh is often credited to King Sennacherib, who ruled Assyria from 705 to 681 BCE. He transformed the city into a metropolis covering over 7 square kilometers and surrounded it with an extraordinary system of defenses. The walls stretched for about 12 kilometers, punctuated by 15 monumental gates and reinforced with more than 1,500 towers. The gates of Nineveh were masterpieces of engineering. Each was named and dedicated to different deities, adorned with inscriptions and flanked by colossal stone lamassu. These are winged bulls with human heads that symbolized protection and divine power. These walls were tested repeatedly, and for much of the Assyrian Empire's zenith, they withstood assaults from rival states. However, in 612 BCE, Nineveh finally fell to a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians, and despite formidable defenses, the attackers breached the walls after a long siege. Nineveh's destruction was catastrophic, and it marked the end of the Assyrian Empire. It's a reminder that even the greatest walls couldn't guarantee eternal survival. For centuries, they protected one of the world's most powerful empires, deterring countless invasions. Ultimately, though, they couldn't withstand the combined might of determined enemies. Yet their ruins are a symbol of how walls, even when breached, can project power and define a civilization's identity long after its fall. Number 4. The Long Walls of Athens, Greece. In ancient Greece, no city relied on its walls more strategically than Athens. While most cities were fortifying their urban centers, Athens took the concept a bit further by constructing the so-called Long Walls. These are fortifications that connected the city itself to its port at Piraeus. Built in stages during the 5th century BCE, these walls allowed Athens to withstand sieges by ensuring access to the sea and, by extension, food, trade, and its powerful navy. The Long Walls consisted of 2 massive parallel walls roughly 6 kilometers long, enclosing a corridor between Athens and Piraeus. Later, additional walls connected the city to the smaller port of Phaleron, and each wall was built of stone and brick, thick enough to repel attacks and tall enough to deter scaling. These long walls played a role during the Peloponnesian War, that's 431 to 404 BCE, and Sparta, whose strength lay in its army, invaded Attica repeatedly, burning fields and villages. Yet the Athenians withdrew behind their walls, relying on their fleet to maintain supply lines. As long as the long walls stood, Sparta couldn't force Athens into surrender by siege alone. This strategy turned the conflict into a protracted war of attrition, with Athens depending on its navy and fortifications to offset Sparta's superior land forces. However, they were not invulnerable. In 430 BCE, a plague struck the crowded city, exacerbated by the population crammed inside the fortifications. The disease killed a large portion of Athens' population, including its leader, Pericles, showing the unintended consequences of relying so heavily on walls. Eventually, after Athens was defeated in 404 BC, after its fleet was destroyed and its ports blockaded, as part of the surrender terms, the long walls were demolished by the Spartans, an act celebrated with music and ceremony by Athens' enemies. Yet the Athenians rebuilt them not long after, recognizing their essential role in the city's survival. In subsequent decades, the walls were repaired and extended, continuing to serve as critical defenses. Today, only fragments of the long walls remain, but their historical impact here is enormous. Number 3. The Walls of Troy, Turkey. Few ancient walls are as deeply embedded in both history and legend as the fortifications of Troy. Immortalized by Homer's Iliad as the setting of the Trojan War, the city's walls have captured the imaginations of poets, historians, and archaeologists for centuries. While the epic poems mix myth with memory, the physical remains of the archaeological site of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey confirm that Troy was indeed a heavily fortified settlement whose walls withstood invasions, sieges, and even natural disasters over a span of more than 3,000 years. The site of Troy is located near the Dardanelles Strait. This is a narrow waterway that connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara and, by extension, the Black Sea. Control of this passage meant influence over trade routes between Europe and Asia. Because of its position, Troy became a coveted stronghold, and its builders invested enormous efforts into defending it. The best-known fortifications date to what scholars call Troy 6 and Troy 7, around 1700 to 1200 BCE. This is the period most often associated with Homer's Troy. These walls were remarkable for their scale and engineering. They were built of limestone. They stood up to 5 meters thick at the base and rose several stories high. The walls weren't smooth. They had sloping stone foundations topped by mud brick superstructures, and the towers projected at intervals, creating strong defensive positions. What sets Troy's walls apart, though, was the resilience of them. Earthquakes were common in the region, and several earlier phases of Troy were destroyed by seismic activity. Yet the builders consistently repaired and reinforced the defenses, sometimes expanding them, and Troy 6's walls in particular revealed advanced techniques for earthquake resistance. As for invasions, the archaeological record suggests that Troy was attacked multiple times over the centuries. The destruction layers of Troy 7, dated back to 12th century BCE, show clear evidence of a violent conflict. While it cannot be proven that this was the legendary Trojan War, the walls did indeed face real sieges. For generations, Troy's defenses enabled it to hold out against would-be conquerors long enough to rebuild and endure. In Homer's Iliad, the walls of Troy are almost characters in themselves. The epic describes them as towering, unbreachable, and divinely inspired, said to have been built with the help of the gods Poseidon and Apollo. For the Greeks besieging the city, the walls represented an insurmountable obstacle. For the Trojans, they were symbols of protection and pride. The legend of the Trojan horse, a stratagem that finally brought the walls down not by force, but by deception, shows the idea that Troy's fortifications were otherwise too strong to conquer. Still, the fact that the city's defenses lasted through centuries of upheaval speaks volumes about their effectiveness. Number 2. The Sasanian Walls of Derbent, Dagestan, Russia. At the narrowest point between the Caucasus Mountains and the Caspian Sea lies the ancient city of Derbent. For centuries, this location was known as the Caspian Gates, a natural choke point through which armies, traders, and nomadic horsemen passed between the Eurasian steppe and the Persian world. Whoever controlled this passage could decide whether empires would be secure from northern raiders or vulnerable to constant attack. To protect their lands, the Sasanian Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries CE built one of the most remarkable systems of fortifications of the ancient world, the Walls of Derbent. Unlike city walls that surround a single settlement, the Derbent fortifications stretch across the entire corridor between the mountains and sea, sealing off the route. Together, they formed a defensive line so formidable that Arab, Khazar, and later Mongol invaders all encountered resistance here. For nearly 1,500 years, the Walls of Derbent played a central role in the defense of Persia, the Caucasus, and beyond. The walls themselves were built of cut stone and extend for several kilometers, anchoring directly into the Caspian Sea on one side and climbing the foothills on the other. They were reinforced with rectangular towers at regular intervals, some of which still survive, and in places the walls were up to 20 meters high and several meters thick. Derbent's walls were tested almost immediately. Nomadic confederations of the steppe, such as the Khazars, sought to move south into Persia and the wealthy lands beyond. The walls forced them to concentrate their attacks at a single point, where defenders could bring the full weight of their forces to bear. Even when attackers managed to penetrate, the fortifications slowed them enough that Persian armies could respond. For centuries, the Caspian Gates became synonymous with a bottleneck that no invader could pass. Medieval chroniclers often emphasized the impenetrability of the Derbent walls. Arab geographers like al-Muqaddasi described the gates and towers, noting their strength of the garrisons there. Persian historians linked Derbent to legends of Alexander the Great, claiming that he had once built a wall here to keep out the tribes of Gog and Magog. Though mythical, these stories reflect the sense that walls were eternal, a bulwark against the chaos from the steppe. In reality, it was not invincible. Powerful invasions, like those of the Mongols in the 13th century, eventually would sweep through the region. But even then, the city's walls remained important. They slowed the advance, provided a base of resistance, and were rebuilt. The fact that Derbent continued to be a fortified city into the early modern period speaks to the durability of the Sasanian foundations. What also set Derbent apart was its role as both a fortress and a city. Behind the walls grew an urban settlement that became a cultural crossroads. Armenians, Persians, Arabs, Jews, and Turkic peoples all lived within the walls over the centuries. Its markets were busy with goods from Central Asia, the Middle East, and the steppe. Fortifications not only kept the invaders out, but also created a secure environment for trade and culture. Today, large portions of the Derbent walls still stand, making them among the best preserved Sasanian structures in existence. Visitors can walk the lines of stone that once blocked the steppe hordes, climb the citadel of Naryan Kala, and imagine the long centuries of watchfulness. In recognition of their importance, UNESCO declared the Derbent fortifications as a World Heritage Site in 2003. They remain one of the few places where the grandeur of Sasanian architecture can still be experienced in its original setting. They exemplify the principle that a well-placed, well-constructed wall can outweigh the advantage of larger numbers or even mobility. Number 1. The Great Wall of China. Alright, so obviously, the Great Wall of China is the most ambitious defensive structure ever built, and perhaps the most recognizable wall in human history. Unlike other fortifications which typically surround a single city or a kingdom, the Great Wall was designed as a continental-scale barrier intended to protect Chinese civilizations from the nomadic incursions for more than 2,000 years. It's not one wall, but a collection of many built, rebuilt, and extended by successive dynasties, stretching across deserts, steppes, and mountains in northern China. The scale, the length, and the endurance of this thing make it the ultimate example of an ancient wall that withstood invasions, even if at times it was breached. Its origins go back to the Warring States period before the unification of China. Regional states like Yan, Zhao, and Qin built long earthen ramparts to defend themselves against both their neighbors and the northern steppe tribes. When Qin Shi Huang became the first emperor of a united China in 221 BCE, he ordered these separate fortifications linked together. This created the first version of the Great Wall, constructed largely of tamped earth and wooden supports. Though primitive compared to later stone walls, it did represent a new idea: the unification of defensive barriers into a single frontier system. The main enemy at this stage were the Xiongnu, nomadic horsemen who raided the Chinese lands. The Qin Wall stretched thousands of kilometers, but the dynasty itself collapsed soon after, and the early sections deteriorated. Still, though the concept of the wall endured, the Han Dynasty revived it and expanded the frontier fortifications, especially to protect Silk Road trade routes. The Han walls reached deep into Central Asia, combining military posts, watchtowers, and garrisons, and these defenses allowed the empire to project power far north of the Yellow River Basin. Centuries later, the northern Wei and Sui dynasties continued maintenance of the walls, but the most famous and best preserved parts were built under the Ming dynasty between the 14th and 17th centuries. After the fall of the Yuan dynasty, founded by Mongol conquerors, the Ming rulers recognized the constant threat from the steppe. They began building a wall of unprecedented scale and permanence, using stone, brick, and lime mortar. The Ming constructed walls that rose 7 to 8 meters high and stretched up to 6 to 7 meters thick at the base. What made the Ming Great Wall extraordinary was its integration of geography. It followed ridge lines across mountains, creating natural vantage points, while in deserts it was reinforced with ditches and earthen embankments. The system was designed not merely to repel attackers, but to buy time, slow them down, and allow the mobilization of Chinese armies. Throughout its history, the Great Wall has faced relentless testing. Nomadic confederations like the Mongols and later the Manchus challenged it again and again. While the wall was sometimes breached, it often succeeded in limiting the scale of invasions and channeling enemy forces into specific areas where they could be confronted. The symbolic power of the wall was just as important as its military function. To the Chinese, it represented civilization itself, the ordered, settled world of agriculture and empire, contrasted with the perceived chaos of the nomadic steppe. For enemies, it was a visible reminder of China's resources and organizational capacity. Even when breached, its presence demanded respect. While the fall of the Ming dynasty in the 17th century came not because the wall failed in its purpose, but because of internal weakness. The Manchus, rising in the northeast, eventually passed through the gates, opened by betrayal and political division, not by direct conquest of the wall. Once the Qing dynasty was established, the wall lost much of its strategic significance, and China expanded far north into Mongolia and Manchuria, and the frontier line shifted. Yet the wall remained, a monument to centuries of defense. For over 2,000 years, the Great Wall of China stood as the line between empire and wilderness, order and chaos. It withstood countless invasions, not by being invulnerable, but by enduring, a wall that really never truly fell, even when the dynasties did. That endurance makes it not just the greatest wall in China, but the ultimate ancient wall in human history.